Parents of children killed in the Sandy Hook school shooting have testified that Alex Jones made their lives hell by spreading lies about the 2013 massacre and subjecting them to relentless harassment, with one parent telling the courtroom, quote, "My life has been threatened. I fear for my life. I fear for my safety and my family's safety and their life."
Jones refused to face the bereaved father of 6-year-old Jesse Lewis and left the courtroom during his testimony yesterday. Only two later smear him as a pawn and possibly on the spectrum during an episode of InfoWars. Jones didn't stop there, also telling viewers, quote, "They all act demonically possessed, the judge, the lawyers. It's surreal to be around them. Makes you feel sorry for them because these people are committed to occult ideology of the New World Order." So I haven't been following this trial particularly closely. Alex Jones is back in the news. We've discussed that documentary, that interview that I believe Glenn Greenwald did with him. My sense of his strategy in this trial, to the extent he has one, is to try to minimize how much of his show was dedicated to talking about the Sandy Hook conspiracy theories and basically say, no, I do so much talking about other issues. This was a very small part, whereas the other side, the families of the victims are, trying to say it doesn't matter how little you talked about it in comparison to anything else. What you said was lies, right, and has had really harmful impact on us. Now, as someone, you like me are very online people and get a lot of criticism and get a lot of nasty behavior directed at us. I've never had anyone visit my residence. I'm very thankful for that. But we get nasty stuff. So I understand the tendency not to want to blame a third party for what someone inspired by them does. Really, the underlying question, though, this is a libel trial. Did he say, things that were maliciously, obviously false, known to him to be false against people who are, depending on whether they count as public figures? And the answer there is pretty clearly yes. I think everyone recognizes Alex Jones is probably the most universally recognized figure as the bridge too far guy, the guy who can't be platformed because he's saying things that bring liability on whoever's platforming them because they violate libel, defamation, etc. Yeah,
I do think that he's going for I'm just kind of I was asking questions approach, right. And people had questions, and some of the pushback I've seen is that folks are like, well, folks only thought there were questions because you were seeding the atmosphere.
He's also clearly not just asking questions. He knows what he's. I am convinced that he's a performance artist. That he knows the things that he's saying are not true. That this is a performance. He breaks character now and then. Every time he will laugh at things he himself has said. He's in on it to enough of a degree. Whereas it's a kind of performance. It's roped in. I don't know how many people he has still watching him, but it's not sincere.
Right, and that to the extent that there is ambiguity, he very purposefully created it. And when you see him go from a trial like this and then pivot right back to his show and continue to double down on these kinds of remarks, it doesn't inspire a lot of sympathy. And we live in a world now, I know jurors are instructed not to look at this, that, and the other, but it is a really interesting strategic choice that he's making. But, he's not exactly always the most strategic or predictable fella.
Well, he also claimed on the stand yesterday, Jones did, that his conspiratorial coverage of Sandy Hook was purely in pursuit of journalistic truth. Let's watch that.
Never intentionally tried to hurt you. I never even said your name until this case came to court. I didn't even really know who you were until a couple years ago when all this started up. The internet had a lot of questions. I had questions. And over that 6-7 year period before I got sued, or 6-year period, it's clear. You can see the whole progression of us, the few times we covered it, trying to actually find out what happened.
Yeah, there's that, I was just trying to get to the bottom of questions thing. I mean, there is this broader question of why it is that this accusation that folks are crisis actors or somehow disingenuous when something really bad and tragic happens is such a recurring theme out of some quarters of the conservative movement. it does seem like there are some actions which are so bad and which cast such skepticism on the fidelity to certain kinds of policies, whether it is, in opposition to restrictions on certain kinds of weapons that cause the most harm, or, other kind of things that reflect poorly on some parts of the more extreme Republican agenda, that the only response from the party is, this must not have happened, it must have been fake.
Well, the reason you can't dismiss these kinds of things entirely is that some conspiracies end up being true, and that it is the case that, for instance, law enforcement does engage in entrapment. And I've talked on the show about, the Gretchen Whitmer kidnapping plot is actually a really great recent example of how it was substantially organized actually by the FBI itself.
But this is Sandy Hook. We're talking about Sandy Hook.
Right. There's nothing to what he's saying about Sandy Hook.
But, to focus on Sandy Hook, because I do think it was a moment that was largely indefensible. I don't know how you can look at all those dead children and in the same breath say, okay, but this is it's justifiable to have these kinds of weapons when we see that they are routinely connected to these kinds of events. I don't know. People still think this is, people can and do say this is very terrible, but I still should have a right to my AR-15. And that's a view that you can hold, but I think the fact that some folks are pushed to this extreme, to lying about it exposes the kind of moral uncertainty of people who are in the position of making that argument.
Asking questions is not a bad impulse, but you should ask questions thoughtfully with some reflection on what the question means and what the implications of it, with some evidence or suspicion you have, some expertise you have to bring to that. And that's what Alex Jones doesn't have. He doesn't, when 90 or 95% of the things you say are easily disproven wrong in service of selling snake oil, whatever it is, you should not have the credibility then to ask provocative questions. You're not the right person to find out, is this actually one of those cases where there is more going on? Is this one of those cases where law enforcement knows more than they're telling us, where the government's got something wrong? That is not a bad impulse to bring to a circumstance, but it should be someone with a track record of correctly identifying those things, doing it, and that's not what Alex Jones does not have that. And that's what I would challenge the people who are still his fans to think about. I'm not saying we should not ask questions or that we should always believe the state narrative or the media narrative. We don't do that on this show. We question lots of things on foreign policy and COVID especially that are mainstream narratives or part of the government's preferred narrative. But we do that, I think and hope, with a track record of getting it right more often than we get it wrong, whereas Alex Jones always gets it wrong.
Well, he's saying there in that testimony that he's never heard of the name of one of the parents of the victims. He doesn't even know who this person is. And it suggests to me, if you were a journalist, that you could have very easily called those people up, had them on your show if you really did have uncertainty about whether or not their child was really brutally murdered. And I think that testimony right there exposes the extent to which he did not have that journalistic instinct at all. He was going for a very different kind of spectacle. Yeah. So we will have more Rising for you right after this. Stick around.